So hello and welcome to part 2 of organ technology. What is sound? Now the reason I wanted to do this as part of the organ technology video series was understanding what sound really is, what's really happening, and what's really happening when we record sound. Is very important to having a good understanding of how it is that we can use a variety of tactics for imitating the sound of a pipe organ, an acoustic instrument, using some type of electromechanical or electronic or digital means. So let's start with the proverbial question. If a tree falls in a forest, and no one's around to hear it, does it make a sound? The answer is no, because sound is how our brain interprets compression waves in the air. In the late 19th century, Thomas Edison and many other people were thinking of a way to record someone's voice. Alexander Graham Bell, of course, wanted such a system for his telephone so that you could leave messages, right? Well, everybody was working on it, and everybody realized this is a really complicated thing. Previous to that, a scientist named Hermann Helmholtz had done all of these sound experiments and proved that sound was this enormously complicated thing going through the air that our ears had to go through all kinds of gyrations to understand. And everybody thought it would be super difficult to record sound. And then Edison up and comes up with like the most simple thing imaginable to record sound. But here's the truth. He didn't record sound. His phonograph captured a mechanical equivalency to amplitude changes over time. And all of the subsequent recording techniques that have been done since then do exactly that same thing. The only thing that's changed since Edison's phonograph is how we store our analog of the amplitude changes over time. First, we did it mechanically with records. Then we did it magnetically with tape. And now we're doing it digitally by converting things into ones and zeros and storing it as a data stream. Let's start by taking a look at what Edison really did. Okay. So what Edison did was he took a rubber diaphragm, and I'll show it kind of sideways here. And then he stuck a needle on it. And then that needle was going to gouge into a wax cylinder. So what happened is that as he had like a tube thing here, and as his voice was projecting down into this thing, that needle was being pushed down and returning to its neutral position. So, when his voice produced a compression wave, it would push down on this needle. If the compression wave had a high amplitude, it was going to push down on it further. If the compression wave had a low amplitude or pressure, it would push down just a little bit. So as this needle is cutting into the substrate, and let's say this is the surface of the wax disc, so he produces a compression wave of a high amplitude, and it gouges down, then it returns to its normal position, then he produces maybe a slower one, and then a lighter one, and then another big one, and then maybe a couple of ones that were fast, and so forth. What you have is an analog of the compression waves flowing through the air. If you could actually see them, they would look something like bubbles that would be floating, pushing through the air. And all that's happening is when we have high amplitude, molecules are getting compressed. When we have low amplitude, they expand out to normal pressure, then they come back down. So the amplitude is how much pressure, which is measured at the peak of each of these waves. The frequency is the total number of peaks that happen in a given period of time. So Edison discovered that you really did not need to record sound waves. You could record an analog of the sound waves. So how this worked in the end was that he talks into this tube that's pushing on that diaphragm, right? And he reads the poem, Mary Had a Little Lamb. Then, when the needle is drug across the surface, that gouged surface, that diaphragm is jumping up and down again. And it's jumping up and down at the same rate and a similar amplitude as what his voice did pushing against it. The diaphragm pushing against the air in that tube created new sound. So he didn't actually record his voice and then retrieve it later on. What he did was he made a mechanical analog of the amplitude changes over time, and those could be converted back into sound. So let's consider another scenario to better understand this fact. So get another piece of paper here. I know I'm not the greatest artist in the world, but I can illustrate a point. So let's say we have ourselves a windmill. I'm going to do my best job to make something resembling a windmill here, and it has blades on it, and the air is turning this thing. I'll put one more in there and make it look a little more balanced. Okay, and let's say we have a generator here, and we're generating electricity, and we go down to a big battery box. All right, and then we have our house over here, and we'll give it a little window so people can see, and a door so people can get in and out. All right, and then the batteries are storing the electricity, and then it's fed into the house. Well, wait a minute. Are the batteries actually storing electricity? Well, let's think about that for a minute. A battery produces a chemical reaction, and it's that chemical reaction that generates electricity. So let's take my cell phone here. There's a battery on the inside of it, right here. When I plug this in to the charger, and we call it a charger even though that's not exactly what's happening, and I charge the battery, and then I turn my phone on, it almost sounds like I loaded that battery up with electrons, and then when I turn my phone on, I'm pulling those electrons back out. Well, that's not what's happening. In our windmill storage battery and house scenario, the windmill turning a generator is producing electrical flow. It goes into our storage battery, and what it's doing is it's producing a chemical reaction with whatever substrate we have in here for doing this job. It could be lead acid, it could be nickel cadmium, or any other number of ways that batteries will produce power. So I've run that chemical reaction in one direction by feeding electricity into that battery. Then, when my house over here pulls power, that chemical reaction is reversed and new electricity is being generated. So I didn't actually store the electricity that I made in my windmill. I actually created a chemical reaction that could later on be reversed to produce new electricity. And this is the same thing, is why we can't record sound. We can't really record light. We can't store energy and retrieve it at a later date. All we can do is store something else that is directly related. In the case of electricity, what we're doing is we're generating an chemical reaction and then reversing it out. The battery did not actually store up electrons for retrieval later. What happened is we used these electrons to create a reaction and used these electrons to create a different reaction. So effectively, I mean, the end result is I had this electricity over here and I did something with the battery and I'm able to get electricity later on out of the battery. Effectively, I stored it. But when we're talking about sound waves, we're talking about a similar situation. I can't actually capture the waves as they roll through the air, store them up, and retrieve them later. Besides which, even if I had a system for doing that, I would only be able to retrieve them once. Well, what good is that? Now, as I showed in my illustration about Edison's phonograph, the same diaphragm that was used to move the needle in and out of the wax cylinder was also used for the playback portion. So if we look at how it's done once we introduce electricity into the situation, what we've done here is, here's our microphone, and inside this microphone, if I could open it up, you would see a diaphragm in there that doesn't look very much different from this one on the speaker. And there would be an electric coil in here. So when that diaphragm moves back and forth, a small electric current is generated and goes out to whatever our recording device is. In this case, I've got a microphone hanging above me, and it is sending it into my computer. So we can capture that, say, the way Edison did, by capturing our amplitude changes over time, and then we can play that back. But the more efficient way to do it is to amplify the sound and then have the amplifier drive a speaker cone. Now we have a much bigger surface to generate that new sound. And so whether we're recording mechanically or magnetically or digitally, ultimately what we're doing is coming up with some way of, we generate an electric current that is an analog to the pressure waves as they pass by the microphone. That analog is stored, and then when we reverse the process out, we then take that analog, use it to generate enough voltage to magnetically move this diaphragm up and down at the same rate and amplitude of our recording, and we get new sound out. So if we, say, attach our microphone to an oscilloscope, and I wish I had an oscilloscope so I could actually do it, as I talked, we would see voltage peaks. The louder my voice would produce big voltage peaks. A soft voice is going to produce softer voltage peaks, and then big voltage peaks, and so forth. This we can record. We can record it mechanically by making a groove that looks just like this in a phonograph record, or we can record it magnetically by simply converting these voltage peaks into a magnetic pulse, an electromagnetic pulse, and we can capture and store that magnetic pulse on tape, or we can do it digitally. And this is where it gets really interesting. So here's how a digital recording works. So let's say I have a simple sine wave rolling through the air. And let's say this is my theoretical 0 point. And my peak is somewhere beyond this. What a digital recording does is this is how the voltage has come off of our microphone. This is what we're seeing on the oscilloscope. Digital recording takes a sample, boom. Then it takes another sample, boom. Then it takes another sample, boom, and so forth. Each time it is capturing the voltage off of the microphone at that point in time. And you know how a motion picture is just a series of still shots? Well, a digital recording is pretty much that. What happens is, let's say this peak point here, this high point is 100. Just an arbitrary number. So there's our 100. So then this one's probably, it looks like it's going to be about 60. And then all of these, this one might be, 65, 70, 85, 90, 95. Okay. We make those into a binary number. 0, 1, 1, 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, whatever it might be. So we have all these points, and each of these points is represented by a binary number equivalent to whatever our arbitrary scale says it should be. Then when we play that back, we have to convert it back into this sine wave. Well, what happens is the digital to analog converter puts these together like a dot to dot. And then we get our sine wave back out. We amplify that, goes to the speaker moves in and out according to this. So again, all that we've really captured is an amplitude change over time. It's when we piece it together that we actually get something that can be turned into sound via a loudspeaker. So basically, if we think all of this through, what is it that we perceive as sound? Well, it's compression waves rolling through the air past our ears. That causes our eardrums to buffet. Then the other parts of the ear kick in and create a nerve pulse that's an analog to that buffeting. And our brain interprets that as sound. So when we're trying to imitate the sound of a pipe organ, or record a pipe organ or any other sound with microphones, what's happening is we're taking those same compression waves that are rolling past the microphone. The diaphragm of the microphone is buffeting. The coil of the mic then generates an electrical pulse that's an analog of that buffeting. We can document that into some kind of recording substrate, either mechanically, as Edison did on wax, or magnetically by converting the electrical pulse into a magnetic pulse that can be stored on tape. Or we can do it digitally, which is the process of just taking samples at increments. Most digital recordings, I think it's like 44.1 thousand samples per second. And then we can play all that back and we get new sound coming out of our speaker, because what's happening is that electrical pulse, that analog to the compression waves, causes the speaker cone to buffet the same way the microphone diaphragm buffeted, and then we get a sound that's pretty darn close to what we would have originally heard. But of course, the ear can always tell the difference, right? Let's say I had a violin player in here. Now I've got a really top quality mic. I'm recording on as good equipment as regular people can have. And that violin would be playing and it would sound a certain way in this room. But when I listen to the playback, it's going to be different, even if the playback is just right here in the same room. Now, electronic organs Why do they sound different from pipe organs, even if they're trying so hard to directly imitate the pipe organ? Well, that's because it's a fairly elaborate task. Now, the earliest electronic organs used electromechanical means, very similar to the way an electric guitar works. You pluck the string, it vibrates past a coil, and that generates the electric pulse. In the first electronic organs used a tone wheel, where you had a wheel, and I've shown illustrations of this on other videos, with little serrations in it. Those roll past a coil, and that waveform is generated electromagnetically, and that's what's amplified, and that's what we hear as an organ tone. The same thing can be done with oscillators, and we're going to explore all of these in details. So you can have an electronic device that generates an oscillation, a electrical current that's constantly varying. And if it's the right wave shape and the right frequency, it sounds sort of like an organ pipe. And then you can refine it and do all those details. With digital, of course, we can record the actual pipes. And then there's 3 different major ways that that information is used to make a digital organ. First, there's digital sample playback, in which the actual recordings of the pipes are simply played back as the musician plays the instrument. The other way is to take that sample and use that as data and simply synthesize that sound by the numbers. And we'll explore that in detail as well. And then there's a more sophisticated way where you take the sample, you use that as your data to generate a complex algorithm that produces that sound from scratch. And there are digital organ and piano simulators that you can have for your computer that do all 3 of these versions. So that's why, we'll get back to our first question. That's why if a tree falls in a forest and no one's around to hear it, it doesn't make a sound. It makes pressure waves for sure, but only if there are creatures, birds, mammals, with a sense of hearing that can convert those pressure waves into sound. It didn't actually create a sound. So that's our organ technology video for today. What is sound? I hope that has shed some light on this thing we call sound and what it is and what it isn't. And now we're in our next video, we're going to take apart a analog technology electronic organ from 1968, and we're going to look in detail at everything that went into making a machine that would sort of imitate a pipe organ. So we'll see you for that in a couple of weeks. Thanks for joining me today.